Welcome now on this second day of reading through the 12 chapters of Daniel for Advent, one chapter a day. Yesterday we opened up with some background on Daniel being a victim of the Babylonian occupation of his sacred land of Israel, and furthermore being a victim of having been carted to Babylon and basically placed in a re-education type of scenario. At the core of all of this, as discussed, is the people of God who are placed in juxtaposition against the empire. What would be generally considered a inferior, smaller, lesser culture, resisting the greater, the dominant culture of the Babylonians. So now we go into chapter number 2. Nebuchadnezzar, the great ruler, has had a dream, and he wakes up, and he wants to understand this dream. In fact, he had many dreams, and he was suffering from insomnia. In the ancient times, and there's certainly many in contemporary settings, view dreams and insomnia as certain omens, as certain signs, and those who are in positions of power and influence, like a Nebuchadnezzar, there was a lot of concern of what these dreams mean, what the insomnia means, what's going to happen. So he's going to compel his magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and the like to not only give him interpretation of the dream, but also to tell him the dream. Interpretation is relatively simple and easy compared to the task of knowing the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. In fact, the circumstance is so severe that he uses this as a barometer for their legitimacy as being wise men, sorcerers, and astrologers. If you are legitimate in your gifted capacity, then you will be able to tell me what my dream was. And of course, that presents quite an issue, as none of these are able to tell him what the dream was. And so they are going to be put to death. However, there is Daniel. And while the other wise men and sorcerers, astrologers, magicians had told the king that no one had ever made such a request, they were quite intimidated by this. Daniel was lumped in to that command to execute these wise men. Remember, after chapter number 1, Daniel and his 3 friends were considered wise men now that they had successfully and subtly resisted the empire and were proven right in their choice of diet. So Daniel is going to stand up, and he knows what the dream was. He's careful to inform that God is going to give him the dream and the interpretation of the dream. And so he gives a prayer of thanksgiving. He goes to Nebuchadnezzar and has a dialogue, and then he is going to inform him of the dream. There is a great statue, large structure, very bright. The statue with a head of gold, a chest of arms in silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron. Its feet were iron that were mingled with clay. And as this great image was standing there, there was a stone that was cut out, but not by human hands. It rolls and it strikes the statue on its iron and clay feet, breaks it all to pieces. The statue crumbles, it all falls down. It's like the chaff, he says, from the summer threshing floors that the wind carries away. When the wheat is separated from the chaff, you can imagine the chaff just blows in the wind. And so now there comes the interpretation. Daniel instructs Nebuchadnezzar that he is the head of gold, that he's been granted power and authority by God, but what will inevitably happen is his kingdom will pass forward to another. In other words, the empire of Babylon is not intended to last. The head of gold will transition, he says, to an inferior kingdom. The chest and the arms of silver, but that kingdom will not last. It will transition into the belly and thighs of bronze, then the fourth kingdom, the legs of iron, and eventually until it gets to the toes, and there will be a divided kingdom. But eventually what will occur is the God of heaven will smash that empire and set up his own everlasting kingdom that will never be destroyed. And so what's happening is essentially Daniel's message to Nebuchadnezzar is that you and all of your power is only temporary. And of course, this was a oracle, a prophetic remark, but from history we can attest that the great kingdoms, the great empires, they come and they go. There's parallel here between Daniel and Joseph back in around Genesis 40. Remember, Joseph was exiled to Egypt, and a place that was becoming and would become the great empire. And there Pharaoh had a dream, and Joseph, who was in prison at the time, knew the interpretation of the dream, and like Daniel, gives full acknowledgement to God. Well, the response here of Nebuchadnezzar is that he bowed down his face to the ground and paid homage to Daniel, it says, gave orders to offer sacrifice and incense to him. So Nebuchadnezzar realizes the authenticity of Daniel. Now some say, and very well may be so, that this head of gold is the Babylonian Empire, and then the arms and chest is the Persian Empire that would come next. The belly and thighs of bronze would be the Empire of Greece, and the legs of iron would be that of Rome at the time of the advent of Christ. And then, a little less certain, is the feet that are iron, with the toes that are iron mingled with clay. Some say that those feet with toes of iron and clay are a future kingdom, even from our perspective, a future kingdom to come. That's what some say. However, I'm not certain that is the interpretation. But what's happening here is another form of subtle but yet stark resistance to the empire. Daniel is standing in front of the king, saying that as great as you are, God said that your kingdom's going to fail, and his kingdom is going to be the superior kingdom. His kingdom will be everlasting. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to bow down to Daniel. Again, this is somewhat humorous. It's supposed to be some elements of satire in all of this. The great Nebuchadnezzar bowing down to poor old Daniel. And there at that moment, Daniel is going to be elevated in the kingdom of Babylon to a high position. So similar to Joseph in the book of Genesis, who was elevated to Pharaoh's right hand, so Daniel will be to Nebuchadnezzar there in Babylon. And what the most striking part is in verse 47, when Nebuchadnezzar says, "Certainly your God is a God of gods and Lord of kings, the revealer of mysteries." And so the leader of the empire is celebrating and, in this sense, giving worship to God. And so Daniel requested that his friends, remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they are also given authority in this kingdom. And so with that, once again, we see this continued theme that is echoed, and it prepares us for tomorrow's reading, where we will once again encounter Daniel and his friends and their resistance to this empire. The big idea in all of this is that God's kingdom is the one that lasts, and rather than God's kingdom being threatened by the empires of this world, rather in turn God's kingdom threatens the empires of this world. And so while Daniel and his people were sociologically in a defeatist point of view, yet still they are winning and have won another small battle here because God is with them. All right, thank you for joining with me. Until next time.